welcome to the Gateway House Special Members Briefing on the conflict in West Asia. My name is Lara Farrar, and I'm the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow at Gateway House this year. So I just got to Mumbai, and I'm sure that you'll be hearing more from me in the coming months. And I'll be the moderator for the discussion today. So we will assess the future of oil flows in the Persian Gulf. And we have two very qualified and esteemed experts with us. Amit Bhandari, the Gateway House Senior Fellow for Energy, Investment, and Connectivity, and Robin Mills, who's joining us from Dubai, who's the CEO of Kamar, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Energy. And he's also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. So we'll talk for about 45 minutes today. The first 25 minutes or so, we'll start with a Q&A with me and our two guests. And then the rest will be opened up to you all for audience Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, please either put up your digital hand or type the question into the chat box. And also, if you would not mind, please identify yourself as well as your affiliation. So to get started, Robin, since you're joining us here from Dubai, just what is your sense of the situation and what it will take to get oil flows, energy flows going back through the Strait of Hormuz if this conflict ends in the next 2 to 3 weeks? President Trump had a speech last night, U.S. time, that basically sort of reiterated this timeline of a 2 to 3 week timeline. But realistically speaking, if the war does wrap up, then what are we looking at in coming months in terms of just this supply line opening back up?
Well, Donald Trump's comments last night didn't really lay out a clear path. Yes, 2 to 3 weeks, but we've been hearing, this will take 2 to 3 days, 2 to 3 weeks, some short period of time since the start. And I don't yet see a credible path for how that's supposed to happen. I mean, obviously the US can stop the war at any point and can stop the attacks and go home. Can it bring Israel along with it? I suppose, if it insists. But that doesn't mean that the conflict ends, and it doesn't mean that normal transit through the Strait of Hormuz is restored, because Iran, of course, is the one making that decision right now. If Iran is not compelled to allow transit by military force, by escorted convoys or something like that, Iran can continue to keep the strait closed, pretty much closed, 90 to 95% closed indefinitely. So, I think there's a big question there. How does this, when we say end, how does this end? I think one of Iran's objectives in this is to make this whole episode very painful for the US so that it's not repeated. Iran does not want to be in the case that it was in June last year, where there's a short war, Iran is damaged, there's a ceasefire, but none of the underlying issues are solved. And the US and Israel think that they can come back in 6 months or a year and attack again. Iran wants a more permanent sense of security. So part of that is to make this episode very painful for the US, but also for the rest of the world economy, so that nobody dares mess with the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz again. And secondly, to maintain some ongoing control. So I think Iran wants a couple of things there. You'll see all this news, of course, of a few ships being allowed to pass and paying some kind of a toll. I think part of the Iranian objective is to formalize that, and indeed have that kind of control over vessels that have to get approval. The money is not insignificant if you look at the number of ships coming and going out of the Gulf and the reported amounts of money paid. Just the oil tankers alone, you could be talking $5 or $6 billion a year, which is obviously pretty substantial for Iran, whatever it wants to do, put that into rebuilding its military forces and therefore strengthening its ability to control the Gulf and so on. But also the political element. And we've seen Iran the ships that do get out are under individual political deals, whether that is with India, with Pakistan, with Thailand, with China. These ships are allowed out under a deal, under an agreement. And Iran is using that leverage pretty deliberately, I think. And again, I think that will continue even if the main kind of phase of fighting, of hostilities has ended. And that's a pretty worrying and uncomfortable situation, I would say, for the Gulf countries, who are obviously dependent on this on the Strait for all of their oil exports, plus other commodities going out and coming in, but also for all other countries who are dependent on that. I don't imagine that India or Bangladesh or Japan or South Korea or any other country that's dependent on the Strait really wants to have to do a deal with Tehran every time it needs to get something. So that strikes me as an Iranian objective, and it may well be one that's achieved for a period of years, even months, let's say, or even years, a year or two, but not one that's very stable either, and still sets up a longer phase of uncertainty, insecurity, and higher energy costs.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're saying the path forward is one that it's going to be just far more complex than sort of the status quo that has existed prior to this conflict with Iran, in terms of Iran still having a lot of influence over the Strait. Does that mean that a lot of countries are going to have to start figuring out different logistics routes in terms of procuring energy, different supply lines? Does this shift energy flows to any degree, or do we have a sense of how this might alter, particularly the countries that have been impacted kind of east of the Suez Canal? Are we seeing the beginning of a shift in supply chains at all?
Well, I think in this scenario, Iran doesn't choke the Strait 90%, 95% indefinitely. At some point, a large part of that normal transit will resume, because of the political pressure on Iran, and because Iran needs to balance how it uses this leverage in a kind of a post-war scenario. But yes, I do think it'll mean probably still a restriction of flows out of the Gulf. But even if flows kind of return to normal, let's say pre-war levels, there'll always be that uncertainty, that risk. And yes, I do think that will mean that countries will diversify their supply routes. So they will look for routes to get supplies in and out of the Gulf that don't go through the Strait, bypass pipelines, the obvious ones, maybe rail, maybe road in different directions. And they will look to other suppliers. Of course, they will look to develop oil and gas suppliers and customers that are not dependent on the Strait. And there's a wide variety of those in the Americas, particularly in Africa. All of those places are going to see greater attention, greater investment.
And Robin, one more question for you before I switch over to Amit. We're hearing out of the EU some of the leadership encouraging the rationing of fuel. What do you think the impact is for the EU in terms of diversification of energy, and how they'll sort of cope with this moving forward?
Well, in the short term, the EU's options are limited on oil and gas, and they already activated what they could in 2022 in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And they've, of course, greatly, almost eliminated their dependence on Russian gas. They've phased out the use of Russian oil. But in terms of other suppliers, they go to the usual suspects. They go to Norway and Algeria and Libya and so on. There's not really much more to come. Otherwise, practically, they get more dependent on the US. But what there will be, of course, longer term will be a new impetus in the EU for getting off the reliance on oil and gas entirely. So further increasing renewables, electric vehicles. That was already extensively after 2022, but there'll be even more of a push for that.
Amit, switching to you in terms of geographies, can you talk just a little bit about what's been going on with India, how this has led to some issues with fuel access here, where India is doing okay, but also what some of the choke points have been, and where India is coming out in terms of just having the infrastructure to cope with this, but also sort of the weak points where the government might need to think more about supply issues in the future should something like this happen again.
Thank you, Lara. So I will look at two fuels first, which the first is liquid, which is petroleum, and second is LNG or natural gas. Now, in case of LNG, imports have been hurt very substantially because Qatar is one of the big suppliers. And the result has been that a lot of industries which rely on natural gas as a fuel have had to shut down. And this includes certain tile manufacturers in Gujarat, for example. And luckily for India, natural gas is possibly 6 to 7% of our energy mix, which is, I think, the lowest amongst all the large economies. Most of our electricity comes from coal. So to that extent, I think India will be less affected by the by what has happened in the natural gas market compared to practically all the other larger economies. Now, in case of liquid petroleum fuels, I think there was an initial shock of the supply stopping out of Hormuz, and since then India has started purchasing more oil from Russia as it was doing in the past. So, and I think there is a sufficient commercial buffer within the country to have offset that changed supply sources. So, by and large, India has a surplus of petroleum refining capacity, which means that we produce sufficient diesel, petrol, aviation fuel for our own needs, and we export some. So we will not be running out of any of these fuels anytime soon. There has been about, I think, a 10% loss of global oil supply. Robin could correct me on this number. So as long as we are able to buy the crude, which we are, we won't run short of these fuels. The one finished product that we do import is liquefied petroleum gas, which is butane that you use in cylinders for cooking. And there we rely on imports for almost, I think, 60% odd of our requirements. And that is the one place where we have actually run short. So industrial and commercial use of LPG or butane has pretty much stopped, and supply is being prioritized for households. So the primary pain point for India in case of oil is really the price. What was $65 or $70 earlier is now about $100. And we are paying an extra $5 billion a month for this. In case of natural gas, industrial supply has been shut down. And if the shortage persists, we will have a problem on food inflation maybe 2 or 3 months down the line, because natural gas is an input for urea manufacture. Other than that, I mean, we are doing as well as we could under the circumstances.
Sure. And I mean, you brought up Russia. The energy sector has been progressively sanctioned since 2014. Do either one of you want to comment on what this means for Russian oil and gas flows at all?
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, look, I think there's been obvious attempt by the US to kind of free up those Russian oil and gas, let's say not gas to be honest, but oil certainly anyway, to unsanction them temporarily. They unsanctioned oil on water that was in transit. They threw out some big numbers, 130 million barrels of Russian oil in transit. Wasn't really true. Probably about 30 million of oil that was genuinely kind of looking for a buyer. They did the same with the Iranian oil. It's kind of remarkable, that the result of this war was so far to relax sanctions, not just on Russia, but on Iran too. And the objective there, I think, was to ensure that China just didn't simply buy up this oil at a discount, but that other countries had a chance to buy it, including India, of course. And we've seen the first arrival of fuel from Iran to India for several years now because of this relaxation of those sanctions. The US, despite what they said, they didn't condition those payments, so Iran should actually have access to those payments. It wasn't as previously being locked away in some escrow account. So that was also a bit of a change. I think it's testament to how hasty and poorly thought through this sanction reversal was. But I mean, this overall is, from the Russian point of view, means higher prices for Russia, not a higher base price and a lower discount. So not as good for India in that regard, in the sense of India doesn't have access to the same discounted Russian oil. In fact, if anything, the Russian oil is possibly trading at a slight premium now that other countries, not just China, but others as well, can buy it. On the other hand, at least the access to the Iranian oil as well is maybe helpful. So there's those two things are significant. But the Russian oil exports are also constrained by the Ukrainian attacks on their facilities, which have been pretty successful and quite damaging recently. So I'm not sure that we're going to see a lot of new Russian oil suddenly appearing on the market. If anything, the Russians are kind of also struggling to keep up their exports.
And Robin, you may have touched upon this earlier. Obviously, there are some alternative supply routes, pipelines to get oil out of the region. They have a certain capacity and then maybe a little bit more of an excess capacity above that. Do you have a sense of, is that infrastructure, how it's being used currently? Is it sort of at full blast? Can it take some more capacity to try to ease some of the disruption from the Strait of Hormuz right now? Just any other additional infrastructure that could be brought online to transport oil through alternative routes?
So pre-war, Strait of Hormuz was carrying about 20.5 million barrels per day of oil, so about 15 million of crude, and the rest in refined products, about 1.5 million of that being LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. So from the bypass pipelines, we're really talking about the 15 million of crude. About 1.7 million of that could go through Fujairah in the UAE, the pipeline to there. That was being used pre-war already. So the extra amount is perhaps 0.7 billion. And then the Saudi East-West pipeline, which runs to Yanbu on the Red Sea, that has a capacity of 7 million barrels per day. Some of that's then used domestically, so about 5 million of exports. And from what we've seen in recent days, that has been used at capacity. So indeed, that port is operating at around 5 million barrels per day of exports. Now, will the Saudis or the UAE manage to get any more out? They manage to debottleneck, improve operations at the ports, whatever. Yes, probably. I'd expect maybe they squeeze a little bit more out, but I don't think we're expecting huge new amounts out of either of those routes. And in fact, the Fujairah route has been attacked by the Iranians several times and damaged in places along the pipeline and the port. So, if anything, that 1.7 maybe of capacity may be less in actual use. And that's it, really. Yeah, there are some routes through Iraq that maybe a few 100,000 barrels per day, but not enough to really change the game. So anything else is going to take time. Any new pipeline, any major debottlenecking, new routes, we're talking 2 to 3 years, realistically, even a kind of emergency situation. So I do think that post-war, all these countries, the UAE, Saudi, and some of the others that are completely stuck, like Kuwait, will try to develop alternative routes and probably do so quite urgently, but still that's a 2 or 3 year job. So it doesn't help us out of the immediate crisis.
I mean, do you think that it was short-sighted that these routes haven't been thought about and developed before, since this is such a crucial, obviously the Strait of Hormuz is so important. And then also, I mean, just there's all in numerous sectors globally, there's just broader discussions about de-risking, finding reliable supply chains. Is this something that is maybe we're going to have to catch up with really quickly? It seems kind of puzzling that this has not been considered before with the Strait and the situation in the Gulf.
Well, so I mean, the Saudi East-West line was built in the 80s, and it was during the tanker war between Iran and Iraq at that point. So that there was actually a need at that point, and then it kind of lay idle for 3 decades. It was used a bit for domestic exports, but not really for domestic use, but not really for exports. And the UA line is more recent. It was built in 2011, so you could say those were kind of far-sighted because
Sure.
nobody really expected the strait to be closed. It was always out there as a worst case but unlikely scenario, and people I think expected if the strait was closed, then the U.S. Navy would reopen it within a few weeks. They were thinking in the kind of scenario of the Iranians would attack with small boats. They would have mines. It would be a kind of conventional kind of closure, and it would take a few weeks of action to reopen it. And a few weeks, the pipeline is not not really justified. So I think it's lucky indeed that they at least built the 2 that they did. But as we've seen, the scenario for closing the strait now is different. It relies on missiles, drones, and especially on the drone threat, which is very hard for the US to counter in any kind of conventional way. Now, would it have been better if those pipelines were built to carry more? Would it be better if they had connected up Kuwait and Qatar so those countries could export too? In retrospect, yes, but it just seems like such an unlikely scenario that there was never the impetus to do more. I mean, the UAE actually was building a second pipeline starting in 2014 so that we carried more of its exports, and at some point that will come into action as well, but not really in time for this current conflict.
Just a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. Amit, back to the pipeline discussion, pivoting more to India. Do you think this is going to reinvigorate a discussion about whether India should be involved with some type of pipeline project to have more security with oil? You mentioned that's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of discussions in recent years. But where do you think that might go?
There are, I think, three serious proposals for pipelines from West Asia to India. So all of these are for natural gas, because oil, I think, is better transported on ships. So the first is the TAPI pipeline, which is the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. And the second project was Iran, Pakistan, India, IPI. The thing is, both of these pipelines pass through Pakistan. So, they were quite they were talked up in the mid 2000s. But given the underlying risk of putting a critical infrastructure through Pakistan, these pipelines are really unlikely to ever come up. So I don't think IPI or TAPI have any future. The third pipeline which was proposed was a Oman or a Iran-Oman to India pipeline, which goes subsea, via the sea route. So this is again, the project has been proposed for a while, but my sense is, given that gas does flow in the form of LNG quite freely, it is not as crucial as it used to be 20 or 30 years back. If we go back to the early 2000s, LNG market was a very shallow market, very few operators. You had to get long-term contracts. So the pipelines made more sense at that time. And given that Iran is going to be the supplier for the gas, and it's given that Iran is going to be the supplier for the gas, it's unlikely that many contractors will want to work there. Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So I mean, given that Iran will be one node of the pipeline, I doubt any international contractor would want to work there. So we would have to continue relying on ships, really.
And that kind of leads to my final question, at least for you, Robin. I mean, how does Iran fit in the future with global oil trade, and rebuilding infrastructure in the region? What could this look like going forward? You mentioned that Iran may have a significant influence over the Strait of Hormuz, especially if the United States just sort of abandons trying to find a way to open it back up and keep it safe and take authority away from Iran. Will the country sort of fold back into operating with other Gulf states? How do you see this taking shape potentially?
Yeah, a lot of imponderables there. Depends about the post-war
Sure.
settlement, and if there is indeed a settlement or just a kind of a stalemate, and the shape of Iranian post-war government and so on. I think we can say a few things. I think the sanctions regime on Iran, on Iranian oil, has broken down. It will be very tough for the US to reinstate it. So that means that more countries, including India and others, potentially have access to Iranian oil, not just China. I think there'll continue to be issues about how that's paid for, and countries will have to find, obviously, routes that don't depend on the US dollar, but they can find such routes, alternative banking routes, and barter trade and so on. But I think at least that absolute, basically that prohibition of Iranian oil going to other countries is going to break down if it hasn't already. I think Iran, well, they want money to rebuild. Obviously, they'll get that from their oil earnings. And Iranian oil, of course, continues to flow at rates at least of the rates pre-war, possibly even more, and of course at much higher prices. So a lot of money coming into Iran now that will be used on sustaining their war effort and building up the military and so on. But again, in a post-war scenario, there'll be some effort to rebuild domestically as well. They'll also be having money for these tolls, significant amount either. And they've talked about reparations and looking for investment into the country from the Gulf states. That's going to be difficult. I don't think anyone's seriously going to pay them reparations. I mean, the demands go the other way as well. The Gulf is saying, no, you pay us reparations. And in terms of investment into the country, look, Iran was always a very difficult place to invest in. Never mind sanctions. It was just a very difficult investment environment, very opaque, a lot of vested interests, a lot of corruption, a lot of companies linked to Revolutionary Guards, which either you couldn't deal with because of sanctions, or that they were determined to protect their own turf, and basically keep people out, whether in the energy sector or other sectors. So under anything like the current government, I don't expect like a Russian investment into Iran. Of course, people will try, But I think practically even China found it was just a very tough place to invest seriously. Okay, you can speculate about very different governments that may be more open. Maybe that will come, but I think the current line is a pretty hard line, Revolutionary Guard dominated ideological regime, which is not going to be very open to international investment. And in that sense, it's a pretty different outcome from the Venezuela case, which I think the US was hoping to replicate.
Well, Robin and Ahmed, that wraps up my questions for the portion of this session. Thank you all so much. We really hope to continue this conversation as this conflict continues.